As humanists, we would like to see more facts, fairness, and love, not only in our own lives, but also in our society. And for people who care, it's very shocking to find out that innocent people get convicted in our justice system. Leon Sinoff has found an important way to help. Leon is a practicing attorney in Columbus, Ohio. Leon holds a JD degree from the Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law and is licensed to practice in both state and federal courts. He was awarded the inaugural Wrongful Conviction Fellowship by the Ohio Public Defender's Wrongful Conviction Project, and Leon has worked on actual innocence litigation in trial, appellate, and post-conviction phases. He currently focuses on misdemeanor cases as a staff attorney in the Franklin County Public Defender's Municipal Unit. Leon will offer his personal opinion on how innocent people get convicted in the American justice system. So let's give a warm welcome to Leon Sinoff.
Hi everyone. I am very, very happy to be here. Very, very happy to talk to you guys about this issue, which is a real issue that I'd love to discuss. And I'm extremely excited to talk to a group of freethinkers about this, because so many of the problems that lead to wrongful convictions are problems, I think, that freethinkers are particularly good at identifying. Problems of emotion taking over and subverting reason. People, searching for a reason to feel better after a horrible crime and wanting an answer so bad that even if they get the wrong answer, that might feel better than no answer at all. And I think those are kind of logical problems that freethinkers in particular are adept at seeing and discovering, and I'm sure you'll see some kind of similar intellectual threads that have led you to be a freethinker in my presentation today, or at least I certainly hope you do. I have to thank everyone so much from HCCO in being so great and helping me overcome some technological challenges here, and Heidi for lending me her laptop, everyone else for being so incredibly helpful, and let's get going. And so we're talking about actual innocence, and the first thing we should do, I guess, is define our terms, and I don't want to spend too long doing this, but what is actual innocence, okay? Well, some situations might be sympathetic. You guys might find these situations sympathetic. You might not find them sympathetic, but assuming you do find something like this sympathetic, this is not actual innocence in what the community talks about, the legal community talking about actual innocence. Someone buys illegal drugs, not expecting her boyfriend to use them in overdose. She's charged with felonies resulting from her boyfriend's death. And she may be looking at many years in prison as a result of this. Well, no one's denying that she was the person who brought the drugs. We might have a legal problem. A jury might want to find her not guilty. You might hope that a jury finds her not guilty. But that's not what we're going to talk about when we talk about actual innocence, okay? B is a similar situation. It's a common kind of situation. Someone is involved in some minor level criminal activity. They get way over their head. All of a sudden, flash decision, panic, and they're charged with something called felony murder, which means that someone died while they were participating in a felony, and it can carry very, very severe penalties. I personally think the felony murder doctrine is wrong. I think it devalues what murder should be, actual intentional killing. Okay, so maybe this person is being way over sentenced, but no one is denying that B did the thing that they're doing, and so that's not going to be actual innocence. Okay. I'm going to talk about actual innocence, meaning that the convicted person did not actually commit the act that they've been convicted for committing. Okay. A was convicted of burning down his house with gasoline. In fact, an electrical fault was the cause of the fire. B was convicted of shaking an infant, inflicting brain damage, in fact, the brain damage came from an underlying disorder, and B never shook the infant. C was convicted of shooting somebody, but in fact, C was nowhere around. It's a case of misidentification, and D shot the person. Those are all cases of actual innocence. And is this just theoretical, or does this actually happen? And the answer to that is this actually happens. There are documented cases of actual innocence. The Innocence Project, that I'm about to talk about, has documented more than 300 exonerations, and an exoneration is very, very difficult to achieve. There are many, many more people who are actually innocent than ever get an exoneration, which is really kind of the ultimate proof. It's a judicial determination that you actually didn't do it. Okay. Does anyone recognize these three people up top?
West Memphis 3.
That's the West Memphis 3. They're probably the most well-known actually innocent people. They were not exonerated. According to the justice system, they are still guilty. They're very widely believed to be actually innocent. I absolutely believe them to be actually innocent. This is them being, at the time of their arrest, and this is them after being released from prison last year. The gentleman in the middle, Damien Eccles, was on death row, and the other two gentlemen were sentenced to life in prison. The only reason that their convictions ever became scrutinized is that some documentary filmmakers, for whatever reason, happened to go down there and film the trial, and what they filmed was shocking. You'll find, if you delve closer into the West Memphis 3 case, that there is a ton of pseudoscience, a ton of kind of religious mysticism that was involved after a horrible crime where 3 young boys were killed, which led the community to just search for the first answer they could find, and they found some strange-looking teenagers and used some poor scientific practices, and the ball just rolled downhill from there. At one point, the government had an evangelical minister testify as to satanic ritual, and testify that based on his knowledge of satanic ritual, these boys were engaged in satanic rituals. Okay, this gentleman below is a man named Ronald Cotton. I'll be hopefully showing a little video clip later on about him. And here's some individuals from Ohio. This individual is Robert McClendon right here. He served over 15 years on a rape charge. This is Ray Towler. I believe he served something like 27 years on a rape charge. And that gentleman in the color photo is Douglas Prade, who was a captain on the Akron police force and was convicted of the murder of his wife. And I believe just within the last 1 to 2 years, DNA demonstrated that he was not the culpable party, and I believe he was formally exonerated. Okay, how many innocent people are convicted? Well, we don't know, so I wrote lots. And I also wrote that it's innumerable. The Innocence Project has identified 311 documented exonerations, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, this doesn't include people whose convictions are reversed on a legal basis but are not formally exonerated. There might be tremendous sense that a person is innocent, but if ultimately the judge rules that the trial was unfair because, let's say, this is a black defendant and the prosecutor kicked out all of the black jurors, which is not permissible, you're entitled to a jury of your peers, that's a legal reason for the verdict being overturned. That's not the same as an exoneration, being declared innocent. So that person will not be exonerated unless they pursue kind of a civil lawsuit after the fact, and they may just want to put the past in the past. a lot of people, after years of prison, and the only reason that they're still fighting is because they have supporters who believe them to be innocent, they might accept a deal. You're worn down after 15, 20 years of prison, you're serving a life sentence. Someone says, if you say you're guilty of manslaughter, we'll change your conviction from murder to manslaughter and we'll let you get out of prison today. Well, a lot of people do that. The West Memphis Three, in fact, did that and accepted culpability for some lesser offense. And it's really horrible to think that, despite the fact that I often feel that many people in the prosecutor's office by this time know or have serious doubts as to the guilt. They feel compelled to uphold the conviction. They feel like they're not doing their job and supporting the state's position in the judicial system if they accept that the person is actually innocent. Okay? Current people who are yet to be exonerated, DNA is still very new. I mean, it's within the last 15 to 20 years. So there's a whole group of people who have not yet had benefit of new DNA technologies which are now available. Okay? And it's almost impossible to exonerate a person who pleads guilty, and the overwhelming percentage of criminal defendants plead guilty. Why would someone who's innocent plead guilty? Well, you might have experiences from the past of being in a situation where you don't trust the legal system, you don't trust the police, you think you didn't do it, but no one's going to believe you. You know you didn't do it, but you think no one's going to believe you. And your lawyer is telling you that if you go to trial, you might win, but you might get sentenced to 25 years. And here he's got a deal where you'll be out in 3 years old. Okay, so if you're a 20-year-old person, you could get out at 23, or you could roll the dice. Maybe you win. Maybe the jury sees it your way. Maybe they don't. I mean, you don't have a ton of experience. Let's say if you're a poor African-American male, you don't have a ton of experience with the legal system seeing it your way and with people being kind of overly ready to trust your interpretation of things. So you're skeptical that you can win. And you say, well, I don't want to be in prison until I'm 40 or 45 years old. I'm taking the deal. Okay? And due to scarce resources, Innocence Projects can only take on cases with very long prison sentences, which is a very small minority of the total set of criminal justice cases, okay? Shoplifting from 7-Eleven or something like that, just kind of on one end of the spectrum, no one has the time or resources to spend exonerating a person. So all of these 300 exonerations that the Innocence Project has done is people with many, many years served and probably many years left. Otherwise, the economics of being a small nonprofit trying to be as efficient as you can just doesn't make sense to fight a 2-year legal battle for someone who has 3 years left on their sentence and is serving a total of 7 years. Okay? So someone after 3 years writes, says, I'm innocent of this robbery. I've got 4 more years to go. And the person who's making the tough decisions looks at it and says, looks like you have a good case, but best case scenario, this will take 2 years to fight. You'll only have 1 or 2 years left on your sentence. This is just not a case we're in position to take. Okay? Okay, here's a lot of questions which you could ask saying, how can this happen, that innocent people are convicted? Don't we have a system that's designed to give people a fair trial? A jury has to unanimously convict a defendant. Okay, so how can 12 people be wrong about the same thing? Okay, and they have to be wrong beyond a reasonable doubt. How can 12 people simultaneously be wrong about there being any reasonable doubt? And aren't there state-of-the-art forensic science techniques which are used by the police to determine who's responsible? And these are all good questions, and there's reasons why none of them actually stop wrongful convictions from happening. This is, I think, the image of forensic science techniques which most Americans have, okay? a bunch of sharply dressed, ready to go people with the best technology evaluating crime scenes. But in my experience, forensic science often looks a little more like this. Okay. So you guys can read through this stuff, and these are just kind of some suggestions I have as to why those alleged protections in the system against wrongful convictions, and they do help prevent wrongful convictions. I mean, if we didn't have any right to a jury, there would be more wrongful convictions than there are now. But why that's not enough, okay? There's tremendous institutional pressure against finding someone not guilty or innocent, and in favor of finding someone who the police have gotten and appointed to as being guilty. What are you pointing out to me, Derek? Okay, thanks. I think the particularly interesting part here is this bullet point right there. Okay, that psychologically, jurors are primed to believe that criminal defendants are responsible, even if the judge says, you cannot use any stereotypes, you must evaluate the evidence. It's human nature. When we see a person standing next to a bunch of lawyers, we think, what did they do? And it's like when you're driving down the road and you see a police car with their lights stopped and you see the poor sucker in the car in front of him, and there he is behind the wheel, and you think, what did he do? No one thinks, oh, how painful it is that, his car broke down on the side of the road. You just went, you see police, you think crime, your mind tends to leap there. I think that's the way most people are. And as much as you try to tell yourself, that person's that person's entitled to the presumption of innocence, there's that little voice inside your head which is saying, what did he do? Okay, so I'm clearly not a PowerPoint genius, and you'll notice sometimes that answers will show up before questions and everything like that. Okay, don't defendants have endless appeals? Aren't these errors caught on appeal and the convictions reversed? No. I've got a slide provocatively titled The Futility of Appeal, and I don't want to go through this in great detail. But appeal is basically all about the law. It's not about the facts. Okay? You can't argue your innocence to the appeals court. You can point holes in what happened at the trial. You can say, I think the prosecutor unfairly kicked off all of the black jurors during jury selection. I think that the judge erred in letting the police introduce the evidence from the house when they should have had a search warrant to go inside the house, and they failed to get that. Okay? Those are the kinds of arguments you can generally make on appeal. The U.S. Supreme Court has said you cannot argue your innocence to an appeals court. It's very, very difficult to raise problems about the facts. Okay? Courts of appeal, and I like this bullet point right here. Appellate judges are kind of self-conscious about their role, that they have kind of an office job, very removed from the courtroom. They come and they read briefs and they listen to oral argument, and they think, who am I to overturn this giant process which so many people put so much work in, from the police who made the arrests, who did all the interrogations, to the prosecutors who spent days and days in trial, to the jury members. I mean, I, the judge, am just an elected official. These jury members, these are the people. Who am I to overturn the decision of the people in these matters? And, I'm not saying appellate judges don't realize that, this is part of their job to overturn cases where constitutional rights have been violated or so on, but it doesn't happen nearly as often as it should because of these institutional pressures. Okay? And look at it from the innocent person's side. You're already in prison at this point. You lost at trial. Okay? You think there might be evidence out there that the police didn't turn over when they should have. Or you think that, there's some medical records that your lawyer didn't get, okay? But all your money probably went into defending your trial, if you had any money to begin with, okay? And your lawyer comes and he assures you, yeah, I'm going to do a good job. And how do you know that he is going to do a good job? And if he isn't doing a good job, what are you going to do about it from prison? So good luck on your appeal. Okay. Here are the 4 common causes of wrongful conviction. I think these are 4 of the most common causes. These are identified by the Innocence Project. Okay. Eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, unreliable forensic science, and government misconduct. Okay, we have good science showing that when, let me back up a bit and say, police officers and detectives are generally not trained scientists, okay? They don't understand blinded tests and how important they are. They don't understand the types of cognitive biases that are at play, okay? And so it's been shown that when the police show 6 photos and ask the person to pick the person out of a photo, that police officer typically knows who the actual person is. And there's very ways that even subconsciously they can prime the person to pick out the suspect who they want them to pick out. Okay? They think they've got the guy, but they need the victim of the crime to make that the identification. Well, you see them looking at number 2, and you know number 2's the guy who's your suspect. Everyone else are the decoys. And they're looking at number 2, you say, make sure to take your time. Okay? There's a way to bias the photo array. And it can be totally subconscious. Okay? And cross-racial identifications are particularly poor. Okay? There's science showing that our ability to effectively translate the facial features of people of other races into convincing, certain IDs are significantly poorer than people of our own race, and that goes for any races. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys a video at this point from a gentleman named Saul Kassan, who is a professor of psychology.
What I want to talk about actually is what I think is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of human behavior, and that is the tendency for people to give confessions to crimes they did not commit. I have been investigating this topic for many years now, and I find that people actually intuitively have a better grasp on why somebody might kill themselves and commit suicide than understand why somebody might confess to a crime they did not commit. You would think, in terms of how common it is, that it almost never happens. When I first got involved in false confession, in the study of false confessions, it was my sense that I was studying a fascinating aspect of social influence, but not an aspect of social influence that was common. The more I see and the more data that have come out, the more we come to realize that people often confess to crimes they did not commit. We know, for example, that if you look at the Innocence Project DNA exoneration cases, if you just take that sample alone, that number now is up over 250. In roughly 25% of those cases, false confessions were a contributing factor. And I say that's surprising because legal scholars for years have assumed that confession is the gold standard of evidence, and that when you had a confession, you had some degree of certainty of conviction. Certainly some people are more vulnerable to giving false confessions than others. And I say that for a couple of different reasons. First, it's important to recognize, I think, that very often false confessions occur voluntarily. That is, somebody who has not committed the crime steps forward without police pressure, without police influence, and confesses to something they didn't do. There's a long history of cases just like that. I years ago called these voluntary false confessions. But then when it comes down to looking at vulnerability in the police interrogation setting, it is absolutely clear from the wrongful conviction data, from laboratory experiments, from self-report studies, that juveniles are particularly vulnerable. They are disproportionately represented in the population of false confessors. That people with intellectual impairments, the mentally retarded, for example, are disproportionately represented in the population of false confessors. And people with various types of mental illness appear, again, in those numbers with large frequency. It is clear that whether because these populations are naive, whether they are suggestible, whether they are overly compliant, whatever that issue may be, it is clear that in the police interrogation setting where influence is the issue, they are more subject to influence and manipulation than the average person. It is common for people, and it would be wrong for people to assume that only the weak and vulnerable confess to crimes they didn't commit. It happens to people who are ordinary, smart, having mental health and adults. The reason it happens is now it gets down to a story about police interrogation tactics. In the United States, police are allowed to lie about evidence. Police are allowed to turn to a suspect who has for hours denied any involvement and to say to that suspect, you've denied your involvement and yet we have your fingerprints on the murder weapon. Or we have the victim was in a struggle, we have hair in her grasp, we've done the test, the hair is yours. Or you've taken a polygraph test, a lie detector test, and you failed it. Or you've been identified by a witness. Or we have your fingerprints, or your blood, or your DNA, or what have you. In these cases, we see a number of these cases where the suspect starts to get confused and disoriented and starts to question his or her own innocence. And often the conversation then turns to questions about memory and consciousness. And there are cases on record where suspects who we now know are innocent not only confessed and signed a confession, but they concluded and inferred that they must actually have committed this crime. There is a misassumption, a misconception in the criminal justice system that I'd know a false confession if I saw one. I've heard police say this, that if they took a false confession, they'd know it. I've heard prosecutors say it. I've heard judges say it. There is this common belief that if somebody were to give a false confession, somehow it would be discernible. It would look different. It would sound different than a true confession. Not so. My colleagues and I several years ago went into a prison outside of Boston to do the following study. We titled the study, I'd know a false confession if I saw one. We had prisoners confess to the crimes they committed for which they were being incarcerated, and we taped their confessions. And then we had them on the spot make up a confession to something we knew they didn't do. We showed those tapes to people. We showed them to police detectives, experienced police detectives. We showed them to lay people. People couldn't really tell the difference between the true confessions and the false. And so it's not a wonder that judges and juries uncritically accept confessions whenever they hear them. It's virtually impossible to discern a false confession just by looking at it or just by listening to it. And that's why there are so many cases on record where there is, on the one hand, for a judge and jury to see a confession. There is, on the other hand, DNA that excludes the defendant who had confessed. Invariably, confession trumps DNA. It's that powerful.
So this just summarizes what Professor Casson said. Low IQ individuals are particularly likely to confess falsely. You know, a person who's borderly mentally retarded, 19 years old, they're very likely reliant on their parents to get them out of, settings that are confusing or difficult. And when the police tell them, hey, if you just tell us, that, if you tell us what we need to hear, and by this point, it's pretty clear what the police need to hear, we'll let you go. They think, well, let me just tell them, then I'll go home, I'll talk to Dad, Dad will know what to do, Dad always knows what to do, okay? Well, they say, yeah, I shot him, I didn't mean to do it, but I shot him, okay? And then the cuffs come on and they're arrested. I'm going to show you guys another video. I can't remember if I meant to show this to you guys earlier in the presentation, but it is an incredible video. These folks do speaking around the country, and this is a trailer for a book that they wrote together. A gentleman named Ronald Cotton, who you will see at the start, and I had his picture up in one of my earlier slides, and a woman named Jennifer Thompson.
The truth should set you free, but sometimes the truth will hurt you.
In 1984, I was a 22-year-old college student. One night, someone broke into my apartment, put a knife in my throat, and he raped me. During the ordeal, I studied every single detail on his face because I was confident, should I be allowed to see the next day, that I was going to make sure he was put in prison and he was going to rot. I went down to the police station, I did a composite drawing. Several days later, I did a physical lineup, and I identified my attacker, and I knew who he was. I was confident I had picked the right guy, and he was going to go to jail. And if there was a death penalty, I would be there to pull the plug. We went to court. I stood on the witness stand, and I put my hand on the Bible, and I swore that I would tell the truth, and I did. And Ronald Cotton was sentenced to prison for life. And it was the happiest day of my life. Ronald Cotton was never going to get out. He was never going to hurt another woman. And he served until 1995 when DNA became available, and I was asked to take a blood test. The DNA test came back, and the detective and the district attorney told me, Ronald Cotton didn't rape you. It was Bobby Poole, the man I had never seen before in my life, the man who was inches from my face with a knife to my throat. Ronald Cotton was released after 11 years. He and I are the same age. During those 11 years, I had gone on. I had been married. I was a mommy. Ronald Cotton didn't get to do that. Ronald Cotton is married now, and he's a daddy. And Ronald's my friend. I'm here to tell you that eyewitnesses can make mistakes.
Okay, so that woman, Jennifer Thompson, was raped. She thought during the ordeal, she said, I'm going to be absolutely sure that I can identify this person. She paid attention to every feature on his face. She wanted to remember it for the police. She picked the gentleman out of a lineup. She was 100% sure. And once DNA came about, it unquestionably proved that it was the wrong person. And Jennifer and Ronald go around the country speaking about the problems of eyewitness misidentification. And they're incredibly compelling if you ever get the chance to hear them talk. What I think is really interesting is arson as a case study of unreliable forensic science. And I think you guys will see a lot of the same fallacies that occur in religious thinking occurring in how arson science is done, okay? I think a very important point to make up front is that no one wants to criticize firefighters. Firefighters are incredibly brave. They work incredibly hard. They're incredibly devoted to their jobs. And they're incredibly popular with the public. No one wants to criticize firefighters. And who are arson investigators? Arson investigators are typically firefighters who have risen up through the ranks, and many of them only have a high school education. And the problem is that they're now in a role where they need to understand the progress of a fire and eventually make a determination as to cause. And that's something that requires an advanced knowledge of chemistry and physics, okay? So how do these folks compensate for their lack of knowledge in chemistry and physics? Well, they rely on more senior arson investigators who are firefighters who rose through the ranks who've been in this position longer. And they point out to them certain features of the fire scene which imply a certain cause. Okay, and some of these might be right. Okay, sometimes fallacious thinking can lead to correct conclusions, but the problem is when fallacious thinking leads to fallacious conclusions. Okay, here are some myths that have absolutely been dispelled. Okay, that certain types of damage to floor areas, when you walk into a room that's been badly burnt in a fire, you can see certain burnings on the floor which imply that gasoline was poured in that area. They call them pour patterns. Okay, and you can imagine how convincing it is to a jury to have someone who is a 25-year fire investigator, started through the fire department, has now been an investigator for the last 12 years and says he's been to 1,000 fires, and that is a pour pattern right there. The fact that the laboratory test tested negative for gasoline or any other kind of accelerant, well, that's something, but the laboratories don't always get it right. Okay, is usually the response. Sometimes the laboratories get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. So maybe we didn't take a big enough sample. But I can tell you, based on my 1,000 fire scenes and my 26 years of experience, that this is a pour pattern. Okay? The angle of a V pattern seen on a wall corresponds to the speed of the fire. This is another myth that has been dispelled. Okay? So a high angle means that this fire spread rapidly is the folk wisdom. And if the fire spread rapidly, then there must have been an accelerant. And if there was an accelerant, that obviously means there was arson because someone poured a liquid accelerant. Okay? The problem is that the angle of a V pattern depends on a lot of other factors. I'm certainly not a chemist or a physicist. I listen to what the experts say, but my understanding from listening to the experts is that the number one aspect is the ventilation of the room. Okay? The V pattern depends on where the nearest window is, and it may depend on how much fuel load is in the area, how much is available there to burn. But things can burn very, very fast without any kind of accelerant being added. Okay? Here's an extremely interesting case. Okay? You may remember this gentleman's name from 2012 GOP election politics. Okay? Cameron Todd Willingham. Was he innocent but executed? Okay? Again, going back to the fact that exonerations are just a drop in the bucket. This person has never been exonerated. This person was convicted, sentenced to death, and was in fact executed. And this is a particularly powerful case because death penalty, and I do not want to get into a philosophical debate about the death penalty, but for anyone who is opposed to the death penalty, who is searching for an example of an innocent person who was executed, Cameron Willingham has been the most convincing one that I have evaluated. Willingham was executed in Texas in 2004 for an arson murder, where I believe his child died. Here he is right there. And here is a photo of the person who did not grant him clemency and executed him. Okay, it's Governor Rick Perry of Texas who ran for the GOP nomination. Well, long after Mr. Willingham was executed, as arson science continued to develop and the fallacies that were used by arson investigators became more and more scientifically documented and scientifically validated, some people took an interest in the case and had a panel of reputable chemistry and physics PhDs who were arson investigators take a look at the case. Okay, Dr. Gerald Hurst concluded there was no evidence of arson. Dr. Craig Baylor said that the trial testimony by the arson investigators at the trial was hardly consistent with a scientific mindset and has more characteristics of mystics or psychics. The Chicago Tribune summarized the findings by saying that all 9 experts consulted concluded that the original investigators relied on outdated theories and folklore to justify the determination of arson. The Texas Forensic Science Commission was scheduled to discuss the report by Dr. Baylor, who had been appointed by them to do a report on this. But 2 days before the meeting, Texas Governor Perry replaced the chair of the commission and 2 other members, and I believe the report was tabled. So it was never, Dr. Baylor's report was never evaluated by the Texas Forensic Science Commission. Okay, and this happened in 2009. That's when, excuse me, Governor Perry was already rumored to be seeking the GOP nomination, and people wondered whether this had something to do with it. Okay, shaken baby syndrome is another one. I don't want to go into this one in too much detail, but there's now considerable medical debate about whether shaken baby syndrome, as it was originally theorized, is a valid medical diagnosis. Pathologists argue that the symptoms of shaken baby syndrome are more likely a result from, and this is one potential example of an underlying medical condition, a rebleed of a hematoma occurring during the birthing process. Okay? Biomedical engineers argue that the G-force from shaking is insufficient to produce those injuries. When you evaluate the weight of an infant, as opposed to a dummy infant, which is often used for courtroom presentations, a dummy which may weigh 2 or 3 pounds versus an infant which weighs 15 pounds or so. And this point is particularly interesting combined with the next point, which is what the biomedical engineers say is that the weakest point on an infant is where the vertebra joins the skull, okay? And that you would see damage to the neck far before you would see these injuries in the brain. Now, if the child is being picked up and violently shaken, why is there, in some of these cases, no visible bruising on the arms or body? And again, we're not, no one is saying that there aren't cases where child abuse is the cause of death, and there are people who are guilty based on child abuse, and those people may have shaken a baby, in which case you often see these types of injuries. The interesting subset of cases is the ones where there's no injuries to the neck, no broken bones, no visible bruising. In that set of cases are the arguments of the pathologists and the biomedical engineers who are skeptical about shaken baby syndrome convincing. Okay? Here's just some reasons why government misconduct also occurs. Prosecutors, caught up in the passions of the adversarial system, may fail to disclose exculpatory evidence. Political office holders, when a high-profile crime occurs, they may feel tremendous pressure to make an arrest, even if that means, we wish we had more evidence, but we got to move now. Okay? I feel like I wouldn't be totally finished if I didn't talk at least a little bit about and these are just random ideas I have on how we might reduce the rates of wrongful convictions. We could demand rigorous scientific oversight of law enforcement practices to ferret out bias and pseudoscience. We could require police departments to institute measures to document, record, and preserve all aspects of police investigations. We could institute rigorous sanctions when the police fail to use these measures. Oftentimes, videotaping technology is available, and this, to some degree, the tremendous expansion of videotaping technology has been because of documented cases of actually innocent people who have later been exonerated, or of documented false confessions. Yet still, even when the technology is there, oftentimes police don't want to use it because they don't want to be cross-examined about it later on. This is really interesting, second from the bottom. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office, the prosecutor who ran that office was particularly concerned about wrongful convictions, and he actually instituted within the prosecutor's office something called a conviction integrity unit. Okay? So now his prosecutor's office has a little unit designed to do some double checking on possible cases of wrongful convictions. Why should it always be the defense's responsibility to investigate these cases. Doesn't the government, as a representative of the people, doesn't the government have its own burden to pour some resources into seeing whether any mistakes have been made in cases which it itself has prosecuted? I certainly think it does, and I really hope that these become more significant within prosecutors' offices around the country. Okay? Here's just a few resources so that if you guys are interested in the Innocence movement or want to get some more information, you know what's out there. These are the Innocence Projects in Ohio. The Ohio Innocence Project at the University of Cincinnati is the largest and the most long-standing. There's the Wrongful Conviction Project of the Office of the Ohio Public Defender, which I used to work at. Jim Petro, who is the former Republican Attorney General of Ohio, wrote an incredible book called 8 Myths That Convict the Innocent. I have not read the book, but the fact that he wrote it was incredible because oftentimes when things are reduced to partisan politics, people think that Republicans don't care about wrongfully convicted individuals, and it's incredibly important that we get both sides of the political spectrum, all sides of the political spectrum, on board, because this should not be a partisan issue. And the Columbus Dispatch did a good series on some possible cases of actual innocence. Now, nationally, the Innocence Project is out of New York, and they're the folks who document exonerations nationwide. They're the folks who have found 300 plus documented cases of exoneration, and their website is amazingly user-friendly and a great place to go and learn more. The West Memphis 3 is just an incredible story, and Paradise Lost 1 is just an incredible documentary for anyone who loves film and for anyone who is interested in these issues. These are also incredible documentaries. This one's a wrongful conviction. This one is about a juvenile person who almost certainly would have been wrongfully convicted if not for an incredible defense attorney. Okay, and Picking Cotton is the book which Jennifer Thompson wrote and which we saw the little video clip about earlier. And that's all I got for you guys, so I would love any questions you have, and thank you guys so much.